correctness. A few years ago, a French author named Daniel Lindenberg wrote a book, An Inquiry on the New Reactionaries. It turns out the New Reactionaries were anyone who dared to say a critical word about 1968 and its legacy. That was sort of the mark of commitment to democracy and democratic values. A full, uncritical, even unthinking endorsement of the cultural, moral, and cultural legacy of May 68. Despite the survival of genuine pockets of traditional affirmation throughout the continent, European intellectual elites, at least, have for the most part attained a state of near perfect indifference toward the claims of revealed religion. I'll tell you a little story, very parenthetically. One time I was in Paris, I'm sitting at a cafe reading, and there's these two Dutch couples sitting to my left. Now the Pope John Paul II had recently gone to the Netherlands, and he had been greeted in a remarkably uncivil way by some of his leftist critics, and some homosexual groups had dressed up in drag and burdened the Pope in effigy. So I started talking to these Dutch couples, very nice people, and I said, boy, strikes me that, what happened to the Netherlands? That this kind of response to the visit of an authentically great man like John Paul II could be not particularly shocking or controversial. And the first response of these very nice people asked me if I was a priest. And I said, no, I'm speaking in the name of liberal civility. But it was a very revealing little incident. Well, I'll let the Dutchman defend the honor of his people. All right, so in any case, the French political philosopher Pierre Menant, who I'm going to talk about for a little while, suggests that a modernized form of Comte's religion of humanity, listen to that phrase, the religion of humanity, has for all intents and purposes become the common faith of post-1968 European democracy. Comte, writing in the middle of the 19th century, argued that a traditional religion, both metaphysics and traditional religion, were historically obsolete, and they would be replaced. He thought human beings were incorrigibly religious, and so the new atheism would have to take a spiritual form, and he called that spiritual form the religion of humanity, the worship of man of himself, collective and individually. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the insights of the French political theorist Pierre Menant, who I think is a very incisive critic of the what he calls humanitarian democracy, or post-political, anti-political democracy, the kind of routinization of the spirit of 68 that increasingly informs European life today. In particular, I'm going to refer to this essay, Democracy Without Nations, that was published by ISI Books in translation a year or two ago. In any case, Menant argues that European elites have forgotten that there are human differences, many that are quite significant. It is only in what he calls the concrete universal, that is the political community, that human beings are able to discern similarity and difference in all their complex amplitude. By the way, notice that contemporary elites managed to talk about human unity, global consciousness, and difference all at the same time, but they sort of jettison an intellectual framework that allows you to think about common humanity and political difference, right? The great nations of Europe never understood themselves to be self-sufficient wholes. As sometimes rivals and as self-conscious participants in a common civilizational endeavor, they ultimately pointed beyond themselves toward the universal foundations of common life. I think that's a very, very important point, that we sometimes forget that the West was made up of nations with particular national and cultural traditions, and yet there was a sense that they were part of a common civilization, a civilization that had a universal dimension. And it really is the case, I think, that when Europeans used to fight each other, they knew each other better. In an odd way, Shakespeare and Goethe and Dante and the sort of expressions of European universality were common points of reference. A Swiss friend of mine says nobody in Switzerland knows other national languages anymore. They meet at academic conferences and speak English to each other, which is the language of communication. In any case, now Menand provocatively suggests that European passivity, as he calls it, and American activism are two sides of the same passion for human resemblance. This is the part of his argument that might annoy American conservatives. Whatever their other differences, American and European Democrats are too confident that mankind is moving toward a world where no collective differences will any longer have significance. He says that we're both in the process of building two parallel towers of Babel, small d democratic empires that would bypass the dialectic of the universal and particular that defines political life. In Menand's view, post-Cold War American foreign policy has been to a large extent motivated by a desire to create and sustain an informal democratic empire under the guidance of a central nation, the United States, which is itself a model and guardian of human liberty. And Menand says there's something admirable about that aspiration. The American approach to the world has the considerable merit of recognizing that human beings do not yet live and are unlikely ever to live in a single human community where force and sovereignty have become obsolete. I don't even think Barack Obama believes that force and sovereignty will become obsolete. Nobody is elected president of the United States, with the possible exception of Jimmy Carter, who believes force and sovereignty will become obsolete. But Americans are increasingly inclined to identify everything we do with democracy as such. These self-proclaimed advocates of a world of democratic nations too readily dismiss the national self-assertion of other peoples when that self-assertion challenges the American tendency to identify the national interest of the United States with the common good of humanity. Let me give you an example. American conservatives got all worked up earlier in the decade about the French. Remember, we wouldn't eat freedom fries, and Bill O'Reilly boycotted France. My view is a little closer to Nixon and Kissinger's view. Did you notice there was no peace movement in France in the early 1980s? Did you notice that the French had a force to frappe, which they took seriously? Do you know that when the Soviet ambassador came to see de Gaulle in 1962, in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and said, well, we have the power to destroy you. And in reference to France's small nuclear deterrent, de Gaulle said, well, Monsieur Ambassador, we shall perish together. Meaning I can push the button too. A little bit of that French spirit of independence, even though it's been tied historically to too much anti-Americanism. It's a much healthier political impulse than this spirit of depoliticization that I've been talking about today. So I think we have to put things in perspective. If patriotic self-affirmation is good for Americans, it's not a terrible thing for other people either, as long as it doesn't take a virulently and ideologically anti-American form. In Menand's view, American theorists and politicians too readily succumb or have succumbed to illusions about the end of history, global democratization, and the process for creating a global middle-class society. And I should add that I think the contradictions at the heart of President Bush's foreign policy, certainly in the first term and also rhetorically in the second term, was I think this kind of rhetoric, this excessively universalist rhetoric, undermined the very practical and desirable goals that the president was trying to achieve. And I think setting up that absolute bar between, achieving some real success in Iraq by getting rid of a a strategic threat and by getting rid of this monstrous despotism of Saddam Hussein. When you sell it to the American people as creating a democracy in Iraq, et cetera, there's such a gap between the prospects of achieving that goal. Or you say, in a rather politically correct view, Islam is just essentially a religion of peace. It's much more complicated than that. And there's just a few jihadists who are getting in the way. That finally was not a believable position. And it really undermined and discredited many of the positive, concrete goals of the administration. So this is the kind of thing I think Manant is talking about.